Hello again, class, and welcome to Lesson 3, Who Wants to Live Forever? Death and After Death. Here we're going to take a look at some of the basic categorizations of afterlife beliefs, things that are going to become useful in the next lesson, or few lessons actually. So let's start off by looking at dying. A lot of literature is written on dying, how to die, what happens after you die. So there's this thing called the soul or the spirit. Kind of vague, really. You can get different people to give you different opinions on what they are. As you can see, almost every culture has a concept, but few ever really define it very precisely. We saw the Greeks, they do have some definition of it. To be fair, it's not always used as strictly as we might like. So as you can see, in almost all cases, a soul, consider the living person's personality and consciousness. So in modern terms, we might just say your consciousness or your personality. So we have this idea, you can survive your physical death. Well, that's another thing that's pretty common too, but that's where the agreement mostly kind of ends. Some are never housed in a body, may seek to steal one. It's pretty interesting. Others take over other spirits or souls. Now, let's start with some of these words. We're going to be dealing with them, and it kind of helps to know where they come from. So soul, from the Anglo-Saxon soul, the animate part of a living person. Only secondarily does it come to mean the consciousness post-mortem. So that's a soul, the part that gives you life. Spirit, from spiritus. You can see from space, meaning respiration. So that's your difference if you go back etymologically. Spirit is more the breathing, soul is more what gives you life. Although you can see why those two get confused very commonly. Ghost, Anglo-Saxon ghast, breathing or supernatural post-mortem entities. Boy, talk about confusing. Well, that's the point. These are not hard and fast categories. They are mixed together a lot. They're confusing, and really no one ever uses them in strict senses. So let's start off with the near-death experience, the NDE. You can see about 20% of those near death claim to experience it. First identified by the French in the 1890s. Well, many claim this is proof of an afterlife. Others claim this has been seen in all human cultures throughout history. Well, let's talk about that last one first. That's not at all accurate. We have hints in art. We have hints in literature that possibly this does happen. But to claim that as proof that everyone in antiquity experiences this is going way too far. So you can see here's a list of some of the most common NDE experiences. Out of body, peace and painlessness, dark tunnel. Okay, so this gives us an NDE, a nice list right down the line, right? Except in not every NDE do all of these show up. They do not always appear in any given order, so it's not like one automatically goes to the other. I could just as easily have changed this list up a bit, and you would find NDEs that would fit more or less the other list. That's another thing. The near-death experience, NDE, not every aspect is in every NDE, and the order changes. So the 5 stages that have been proposed by those who are proponents of the NDE as a real phenomenon that may indicate an afterlife. You can see peace, separating from one's body, entering darkness, seeing a light, entering that light. So far, so good, and yet again, we hit the same problem. Neuropathological research, people who are actually having their brains scanned while this happens. There's no set order for these. Believe it or not, that's actually kind of a problem. Because if you're using this as evidence of some sort of an afterlife, it'd be nice to know that there's some sort of a progression in this afterlife as opposed to just this random jumble. But then again, only about 1 in 5 people experience this, so that is also kind of difficult. And here's another thing to consider. Ever since the French identified it, most of the research has gone on in the United States, secondarily in other Western cultures. I tell you, very very little research has gone on to the near-death experience in Central Asia among indigenous peoples in South America. You get the idea. 17% critically ill patients, 20% nearly die for other reasons. At the end of the day, what research we have, and believe me, scientists and medical experts have been looking at this intently since the 1970s, find no standard death experience. There does not seem to be a set pattern of the NDE, and we're only looking at the US mainly with Western European input. You start bringing in other cultures, honestly, there's no clue what we might find. So what are they? Well, there are a lot of models. Depersonalization model is one that's often cited. Hallucinations with the mind brains. You're in an extremely life-threatening situation. This is known to happen with someone, for instance, is in a fire and they're literally burning. People in those situations, like people in traumatic car accidents, for example, also report that they'll float over their body. Well, psychologically, that's believed to be a way of protecting yourself from the trauma. That is a known phenomenon. But as you can see, not every NDE is in such a situation, so the depersonalization model works for some, not for all. The expectancy model. Basically, people have this hallucination because they're hoping to see it. Culturally bound wish fulfillment. That probably is playing into it too, to be honest. But if that's the case, I would ask, why is it 4 out of 5 people don't have this? Religion is held by the vast majority of Americans. And when I say the vast majority, the latest research indicates probably 90% or over 90% of Americans believe in some form of religion, if not afterlife. Wouldn't the expectancy model have a much higher number of people? We can recreate them medically. That's something else to consider about the NDE. If you start playing with the brain, if you start playing with oxygen levels, you can see if I lower your oxygen level, you're going to start having an out-of-body experience. You're going to start reporting a lot of the NDE. Another thing that happens, and this was research that was done in the 70s in particular with military personnel, military people working at NASA who would get inside these sort of centrifugal little cabins. The idea is to get you accustomed to high G forces, high gravity forces in aerial combat and in rockets. They'll spin you around until you pass out. And people in those situations report having out-of-body experiences, NDE-like symptoms, but they're created mechanically. Brain surgery. Their subjects can experience NDEs. Literally, if the brain surgeon's got your head open and he pokes around in the right areas of the brain, you're going to start seeing dead relatives. You're going to start having out-of-body experiences. You're going to start floating through tunnels. So I wouldn't say that disproves the NDE as a phenomenon. I would say that we need to be careful taking it as evidence of some sort of afterlife evidence. And the last part, in almost all physical explanations, the temporal lobe is important. It seems to be the central actor. So whatever's going on with the NDE, and we don't completely understand it, let's be fair, the temporal lobe is somehow involved. This looks really, really physical. Now, one other thing to note. Notice less than 10% report visions of hell. Over 90% of people report heavenly visions after death. And in what is honestly fascinating to me as a religious studies scholar, almost everyone who reports seeing hell was raised evangelical Christian. If you're raised Southern Baptist, if you're raised Pentecostal, if you're raised in some other form of a hellfire and brimstone upbringing, you seem to be preconditioned to have a hell experience if you have an NDE. That's interesting. Atheists tend to have a heaven experience. Agnostics, heaven. Catholics, heaven. Evangelical Christians, hell is possible. Again, I have to ask, are these really proof of anything? Now, of course, you're free to believe what you want, but all this, and I find this a fascinating subject, all this, I would say, brings into question whether the NDE really indicates anything after this current existence. Then there's this. This is great. 21 grams. What do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. Well, you can see this guy, Douglas MacDougall. There's a good Scottish name for you. Proves the soul weighs 21.3 grams at death. How did he do that? Well, you can see 6 patients made measurements with one of them. And if you have done anything in the sciences, you know that that is a number that is statistically completely irrelevant. You can't do a test with 6 patients and only do accurate measurements on one of them and claim you now have a universal rule that applies to everybody. It's absurd. Well, he wants more experiments. He also wants to photograph souls leaving the body at death. He thinks it can be done. And to be fair, some photographers are going to oblige him. They're all going to be phonies. Small sample size, poorly calibrated equipment, as was discovered later when his equipment was looked at. Selective reporting. Okay, so this one would seem easy to dispense with. The soul does not weigh 21 grams. So what's happening? Well, at death, if you have a person, and this has been found often, people often lose a tiny bit of weight when they die, and it does come out to be a matter of grams. Well, easiest explanation that they don't breathe anymore. There's no more air in them. So right away, the air. Even at the time, in 1907, that he comes up with this idea. Maybe the lungs are cooling the blood at death, so you get sweating. And yet you'll still see this around. You'll see it on the internet. You'll see it in books that the soul weighs 21 grams or 20 grams. Okay, a look at death and the things that we tend to believe around death. What about the after death? Here we get some fun stuff. So, human cultures worldwide, we can roughly group all the afterlife beliefs into 4 categories. And I say this roughly, and honestly, I say this because I would not be surprised to hear of a 5th in some culture somewhere. Humans have an interesting variety of things. For the most part, though, everyone I've encountered, 4. The otherworldly journey, the cis-worldly immortality, reincarnation, and oblivion. All of these have variations. So it's not like they all have only 4 categories. You're going to get variations within a category. So, you can think of it as category 1, subcategory C or something. And we will take a look at each of these. First, oblivion, probably the easiest one. This says when you die, you snuff it. Bam, gone, boom. Minority belief, because most humans don't like this. They don't find it satisfying. And so the vast majority of people believe their personalities, souls, spirits, whatever, survive the death of the human mind brain. Oblivion says, nope, ain't happening. You're just gone. Whatever you were, all your memories, all your likes and dislikes, dissolve. People who believe this will often tell you there's no such thing as a soul, but there are those who believe there is such a thing as a soul, but it dissolves at death. How do you find evidence of oblivion? It's kind of hard. Even in the literature, it's rare that you get an ancient tale saying, and his soul broke apart at death or something. It's difficult to ascertain a belief in it, but to be honest, we're pretty sure it's a rare thing. We don't seem to see it in what we can ascertain. Jehovah's Witnesses maintain something of a belief like this. It's a sort of a subcategory. They believe all souls obliviate at death. That's a key aspect of the Jehovah's Witnesses. When you die, your soul just poofs. That's the judgment for Adam and Eve's sin in Eden, as you can see. There is a resurrection. God recreates your soul from memory. That's what gets judged, which is kind of unfair, I guess. If you are found worthy to continue, you will be saved and your soul gets to continue to exist forever on the new earth mainly, maybe the new heaven if you're one of the 144,000. If you're damned, he's not going to torture you. He's just going to, and your soul is going to dissolve again, this time permanently. And you'll forget everything that happened. Buddhism has a concept like this. Theravada Buddhism in particular, the School of the Elders, maybe the oldest branch of Buddhism. You can see the focus on the Buddha of the present age. Okay, so what's this got to do with what we're dealing with here? Well, the Buddha, freed from samsara, you can see, he realizes the nature of existence. 3 marks are dukkha, anatman, and anicca. Dissatisfaction, often called suffering a little inaccurately. Non-self impermanence, nothing's permanent. As long as you exist, you're going to be dissatisfied in every way, shape, and form, really. Yourself is not real. At death, your soul pretty much dissolves. That's a key element in Theravada Buddhism. There is a little sort of bit that goes on in the karma that become in the next karma, but it's not the way we tend to think of it in Western movies. It's not where your soul automatically goes from one body to another and bam, you're done. In the movies, this tends to be portrayed by the actor in the next body, but in the mirror, it's the same face, it's the old body. The way this tends to get explained, especially out of Sri Lanka, which is one of the places I'm most familiar with, is that it's like a candle. You have a lit candle, you have an unlit candle. When you transfer, when you light the second candle, okay, but that second candle, although it was lit from the first, that's not exactly the same flame. So it kind of is, but it is a different wax, different wick. So in a way, you are inheriting and having to pay for the karma of somebody else. I know it's getting kind of iffy on this one, but that's the way they tend to look at it in Theravada, that there is a certain amount of oblivion going on here. And we get the truths of existence. You have to understand dissatisfaction. And again, you want to get away from it. You want to break the cycle of samsara. You don't want to live forever. So what you're looking for is ultimately to get out of samsara. Even though most of what you were will obliviate into the next life, it'd be nice to get rid of the whole thing. Buddhism technically has no God, although you can find many cultures, many people who pray to the Buddha, and that's lived religion for you. People act differently than they're supposed to act, maybe. But the Buddha realizes how to end the cycle of rebirth and suffering. What is he going to do? He's going to get out of it, and it's going to be through that oblivion. So, the Buddha, even though he may have believed in gods, not that big a deal. They don't seem to affect humans. The path to nirvana. I was always taught that nirvana was a heaven. Of course, that was a terrible way to teach it. I learned from people that didn't know what they were talking about. I've heard happy non-existence. That's an interesting way of putting it. You don't exist, but you're happy about it. Basically, at death, when he goes into parinirvana, his soul dissolves. The Buddha is no longer. Therefore, he's not bound by samsara. He is no longer going to be dissatisfied. Now, look at the top left. Early Buddhist portrayals of the Buddha were essentially aniconic. That means they don't have a particular icon, or in this case in which I'm using it, probably anbuddhic is a better way of putting it. You do not find in the earliest Buddhist art portrayals of the Buddha. Why? He's not here anymore. His body's dead. His soul's obliviated. There is no more hold that samsara has on him. So what you get? Empty footprints. You may get an empty chair under the Bodhi tree. So oblivion in Theravada in particular has a very positive spin on it. You escape the wheel of eternal rebirth. You're going to escape dukkha. You're going to escape that continual dissatisfaction. Most Buddhists, though, believe you're going to be reborn, so you're kind of stuck here. But this is probably the most famous area where oblivion comes into play. So, oblivion's true, right? I hear this all the time. Oblivion should be the neutral state. Why? We should assume that we all dissolve at death and that we're done because no one comes back from the dead to tell us otherwise. Well, that's an argument from silence. I don't have the answer. I have to admit, if you're asking for proof, there's no proof for anything. Of course, how do you prove oblivion? That's going to be a big problem. Not only is oblivion hard to falsify, it's hard to prove. I mean, it's hard, period. All consciousness is centered in the mind-brain. That's just a key physiological fact. When you die, your mind-brain quits functioning. All personality that you have, your entire consciousness, really cease functioning. That's about as far as we can push it. Is that automatically the end of you? Sure seems like it, but since we can't completely explain what consciousness is, how it arose, and how it works, probably best to reserve judgment. Now, reincarnation, transmigration. So you survive your physical death, find a new home in another body. If you take this, again, transmigration, this tends to be where your full soul is moving body to body. This is more like that Hollywood movie where your last soul is looking out at you from the mirror. It doesn't have to be a human body, though. You can go from body to body. As you can see, often associated with South Asia, but many cultures have the concept. I just like this cartoon here, reincarnation. So you have many, many names that you can be introduced by. Confusing. I can barely keep track of my own identity. So we get back to samsara. And I think it's right to include it in both oblivion and reincarnation because it really does kind of straddle both, honestly. It's not easy, and it just sort of sits in both realms. So you can see samsara, we mentioned it already, endless cycle of birth and rebirth. Even the gods have to go through that. And this gets us to the concept of karma, just as a little reminder. What are we talking about? Well, dharma is the order. Truth, harmony, order. If you follow dharma, you get good karma. If you violate dharma, you get bad karma. You see where we're going. Dharma is the rule. Dharma is the way things are supposed to work. And dharma is not imposed by a god. It's not a set of laws that are given to you that you must say yes or no to. It's just the way things work. And if you really go in violation of nature, of the cosmos, it's just not going to go well for you. So what we traditionally call Hinduism, and believe me, we can have a whole class on even the word Hindu because it's all over the place. Cremation, standard in South Asia for corpse disposal. Ideally, your ashes get scattered to the Ganges. Rebirth is certain. You might reach moksha. Moksha, the end of samsara. Although in what we tend to call Hinduism, again, it's kind of vague. Moksha is not really something you need to worry about. You're probably not anywhere close to it. Most people in South Asia, most of what we call Hindus, tend to see reincarnation as just an over and over and over again thing, almost automatic. You're just going to be stuck with it. And this picture is a funeral. Come on, you're impressed. You know that's how you want to go out. You want to get torched in front of all your friends. Then you have the Jains, also in South Asia, who see an eternal cosmos that changes, but is, in cycles, never born, never dies, never begins, never ends. And as you can see, souls, jiva, as they're called, your jiva, will constantly go through this universe. Never stays in one state, goes through a devloka or a naraka, what we tend to translate as purgatory. It's various states after death. And then you're reborn, and it just keeps going and going and going. In that sense, Jainism is quite similar to other South Asian traditions where your soul, your personality, your consciousness is going to be around for millions of years. So strap in for the ride. Now, death and after death. Cremated corpses, kind of standard in South Asia. Santara is a possibility to get rid of your karma. Santara is starving yourself to death, but only under very strict rules. You can't just do it when you're young and you don't want to live anymore. This is more like when you're old, when you're terminally ill, you're already on your way out, you decide to purify yourself of the karma. That's what this woman has done, actually. She's either just finishing Santara or she's just done it. And you see some of how the soul is conceived of in Jainism. Now, Jainism sees the universe operating automatically. There are quite a few religions that do that. In fact, the idea of a God directing the universe is a kind of a minority position, to be perfectly honest. That's more Christian, Jewish, Muslim. So the mechanism of reincarnation is kind of an autopilot. It's barely involving you. You get to make choices on how you react to dharma, but it's not exactly your choice on a lot of things. It's just going to happen. Now, are there modern reincarnation cases that we would be interested in? Well, actually, sort of. Worldwide, and I do mean worldwide, we have many accounts of children as they're very young who talk about their children, grandchildren, other lives. Now, if you're in South Asia or another culture, Japan or whatnot, that will buy into reincarnation, this is not a problem. You know, they're just looking at it as, oh, they're the last memories of the old life are dying away. This does happen in the United States and in the West, and it tends to freak people out because Christianity has no place for this. And yet it happens. I knew of a case of at least one child years ago, constantly talked about his family. He was about 2.5, 3 years old. It was eerie, admittedly. Then he forgot about it as he got older. By 5, he had no idea he'd ever done it. And that's common too. You can see much more common in India and Sri Lanka where the construct exists and is encouraged. In America, we tend to just sort of hope it goes away. But up to 33% of Americans believe in some form of reincarnation, including 29% of Christians. How do we account for this, incidentally? It's hard. One possibility, though, and it is worth taking seriously, is that children are sponges. From the very moment that they pop out of mommy's tummy, and honestly a little before, because they could sort of hear in the womb, they're getting a lot of stimuli. They're hearing a lot of things, and their brains are developing. Odds of them remembering what they're hearing accurately is not good, but some of it's probably getting stuck in there. It would not surprise me if we found that these cases of children talking about other lives are the children unconsciously regurgitating portions of conversations they've heard since they were born, but they don't know it. Their minds are creatively creating this alchemy of a new memory. But I can't prove that. That's more of a surmise than anything. So, like I said, the children, is it possible? Is it not? Hard to say, and it neither proves nor disproves anything. There's where we're stuck. The otherworldly journey. This is the one that you're probably most familiar with, and honestly, we're not going to spend much time on. The otherworldly journey, your personality, soul, spirit leaves this realm, this world for other places. This is where you get your beliefs in heaven, in hell, in purgatory. This is where you leave this world for a different place. If you're a Western Christian, it tends to be up or down. If you're an Eastern Christian, it's a different state of being, but you're out of this world. That's the otherworldly journey. We see it with the Greeks. We mentioned that with Plato. Like I said, we're most familiar with this, so we're really not going to spend much time on it because for most of you, it clicked as soon as I said something. The last one, and the one that's also interesting, cis-worldly immortality. You stay in this world, you stay in this realm as something. Your soul, spirit, somehow your personality, your consciousness sticks around. This is where you place the construct of the ghost or the poltergeist or even the ancestors in some cultures where you stick around and help your surviving children, grandchildren, whatnot. And it is worth mentioning what I have at the bottom. The most common supernatural entities for all religions throughout history are the recently dead. More humans throughout history and around the world deal with the recently dead than they do with gods, because the recently dead care more about you. People are more interested in what mom's doing on the other side of the veil of death than about the creator God who's up there and who may not even be paying attention half the time. May sound strange for a Christian where you're accustomed to impose everything on the God construct, but the recently dead tend to be your most important supernatural elements. And just to give you an idea how other cultures handle this, China. This concept exists. The living can threaten ghosts and spirits, so even once you're dead, you can still be threatened. You can still engage with the living. Ghosts can even be killed. Think about that. You can die and then die again. In early Chinese writing, it doesn't seem that having a good afterlife is a particular concern. There's not this worry that you should go to heaven and be happy. But to be fair, early Chinese afterlife writing as we have it doesn't seem to focus a whole lot on this. They don't really get into the details of how immortality functions. It's just sort of there, and we're good to go. We do have this construct of the ancestors. Many cultures have this. China's very famous for it. Japan takes it up as well. Ancestors are so important that, well, like a modern relationship with your family, you have to call them, you have to talk to them. God, you have to go over on Thanksgiving. You know you can't stand it because you're just going to be standing with this cousin who's rude and eats the turkey, you know, bare hands. Guess what? Same thing with the dead. Once they're dead, you still have to keep contact with them. You still have to pay attention to them. You still have to work on that relationship. Every bit as important. And it takes work. The ancestors are keeping up with you. You need to keep up rituals for them. They will help you. You help them. Japan, very similar. The construct to a great extent is related to the Chinese construct. And I do want to mention this. It's a popular misconception that Japanese and Chinese, Japanese in particular, worship their ancestors. No, they don't. They venerate them. Their ancestors are incredibly important to them. They don't worship them like they are gods. It's a total misunderstanding. But then again, the concept of God is not something that translates into Japanese religion well at all. The dead can become kami if certain rituals are performed. In fact, if the right rituals are performed, they become Buddhas, which is a different construct completely. The Kofun peoples venerate nature as well. So this idea of the recently dead is tied up in Japan. There's a lot of tying up with nature as well, not so much in China, but it's important. It's very important that there's some sort of immortality in this realm. Now, kami. You can see a definition from Japan. It's hard to put in. Spirit, mind, Newman, something like that. And they can be anything. Nature spirits, ancestors, Yamato leaders. Technically, the emperor of Japan is a kami. Heads of household, you can see. You can be anything can be a kami. Anything with unusual qualities. This is what Japanese indigenous religions tend to be interested in, not gods. And the dead ancestors can become a kami. One way to interact with the dead, memorial tablets. You can see from the Asuka period. There's a picture of a great deal of them on the right. Often treated as though they are physical representations of the deceased. Now, it's not a situation necessarily where they are possessed by the spirit. That's not what we're talking about here, but there is something of a connection. And as you can see at the bottom, a lot of Japanese civilians were killed in the Second World War when their homes were firebombed by the Allies, and they would go back in the homes to save the memorial tablets because those were incredibly important to them. And it's worth mentioning an interesting aspect to this. The US, of course, drops 2 nukes, Hiroshima on August 6th, Nagasaki, August 9th. In Japanese culture, there's this concept that you need direct descendants to perform certain rituals for you to become a Buddha, to become sort of an ancestor spirit proper that can help your descendants and whatnot. Well, what happens if you're a child? What if you're 13, you have no kids, and you're killed? How do you have a proper afterlife? That actually is a major issue. There are millions of Japanese that have no lineal descendants. They're killed. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. War dead, similar situation. You're a young man, you're fighting in the Japanese military, you're a kamikaze. You have no descendants to help you. Well, this leads us to something called the Moen Botoke, the unconnected dead. You're sort of stuck between life and death forever. You can never have the proper rituals to get you fully onto that other plane of existence. So you should be an ancestor. You should be helping your descendants. You're never going to get there. You don't have any descendants, so you're kind of jammed. Forever caught, the descriptions I've encountered indicate that this is a very melancholy state to be stuck in. Well, Japan had to adapt. New rituals. Not unusual. If you die childless, have your ashes made into a gravestone, kept at a temple. That's what you see at the upper left. It's an interesting concept, but you can see the logic in a way. What happens if you need ritual? What happens if you need the help of living and you have a relationship with the living, which is give and take, and the living are gone? That hurts a lot. Well, that's our brief look at the constructs of the afterlife. We're going to look more at ghost, poltergeist, whatnot in the next lesson. So thank you for coming along for the ride. We'll see you next time.